first thing we need to do is open up our settings.py file in our app, and we're going to add above DRF Spectacular, just to group them all together, REST_framework.auth token. Now this comes built into Django REST framework, but it's a separate Django app. So we need to enable it inside our settings.py file so that we can add the support for authentication tokens with the Django REST framework. Okay, so you can save this file here, and then we're going to head over to our Code Explorer, and we are going to open up the serializers.py file inside our user app. And we're going to create a new serializer specifically for our auth token. Now we need to add some imports to the top here. So where we have get user model, what we're going to do is add some brackets around this because we're going to have it on multiple lines. I have multiple imports here. We're going to import get user model just as we do here, and then authenticate. So this is a function that comes with Django that allows you to authenticate with the authentication system. Okay, so the next thing we need to do is import translations. So we'll do that by typing from django.utils.translation import get text as, and then we'll just import it as underscore because that is the common syntax for doing the translations with Django. Okay, so next what we'll do is we'll create a new class here. So we'll scroll down, do class auth token serializer. And this time we're going to base just off the default serializer class. So we're not going to base off model serializer. We're just going to create a basic serializer that isn't linked to a specific model. So we'll type serializers.serializer with a capital S on the second one, colon, and then serializer for the user auth token. And then we're going to type email equals serializer.email field, password equals serializer.char field, and we're going to pass in style equals input underscore type password, and then trim underscore white space equals false. So what we've done here is we've defined a serializer with two fields. The first is the email field that we'll use to authenticate with, and that is just the email address of the user. And the second is the password field. So the password field is a character field, and we've added this style input type password here because when we are using the browsable API, we want the input type to be a password so the text is hidden. And this is kind of optional because really you only use that browsable API for testing and development, but it is still nice to have a secure password field when you're using that API. Then you have trim white space equals false. So Django REST framework by default will trim the white space off the input for the character field. So if you input some text and you add an extra space at the end, then it will trim that space off. And we don't want this to happen with the password field because it's very plausible that the user might have a space at the end of their password, and they may have done that deliberately. So they may deliberately have a space at the end of the password, and we want to ensure that that space is maintained in the system when they're logging in, if that is what the password has. Okay, so next what we'll do is we're going to add a validate method. And the validate method is called on the serializer at the validation stage when it goes to validate the input to the serializer. So below password, we're going to add a space, and then we're going to do def validate and self, comma, attributes, which is short for attributes. Validate and authenticate the user. So this is where we're going to add the logic that authenticates the user that is logging in. We'll do email equals attributes.get email. So that gets the email address that was passed to the endpoint. The next one is password equals attributes.get password. And that's going to retrieve the password from the attributes. And then user equals authenticate request equals self.context.get request. And then username equals email, and password equals password. And then we're going to have if not user MSG, short for message, equals underscore unable to authenticate with provided credentials. And then arrays serializers dot validation error MSG code equals authorization. Let's make sure I spell that correctly. Okay, and now underneath that, we're going to do attrus user equals user, and then return attrus. Okay, so let's just save the file and then I'll talk through what we do here. So here we are defining a validate method for our auth token serializer. And as I said, the validate method is going to be called at the validation stage by our view. So when the data is posted to the view, it's going to pass it to the serializer, and then it's going to call validate to validate that the data is correct. So as part of the validation, we're going to retrieve the email address, and then we're going to retrieve the password that the user provided in the input. After that, we're going to call this authentication function that comes built in with Django. So what this function does is it accepts three different things. One is the request context, which contains things like the header metadata and things like that. I'm not sure why it needs it for this actual purpose. I think it's just to make sure that the request is passed consistently through the system. I don't think it's going to be using it in our situation. We're just simply using it to check the username and password, but it is a required field, so that's why we pass it in. And we can get the request context by calling self.context.get request. Then we pass in the username, but we set it to the email address because, as we mentioned, we're using the email as the username in this case. And then we pass in the password. So what this will do is it will check that username and password is correct. If it is correct, then it's going to return the user. If it's not correct, then it's going to return nothing and just give us an empty object. So then on line 43, what we're doing is we're checking if the user was set. So if not user, so if the user didn't return anything with that authentication request, then we're going to set the message as unable to authenticate with provided credentials. And we're going to raise a validation error. So this is the standard way to raise errors with serializers. If we raise this error, then the view will translate that to a HTTP 400 bad request, and it will include the message that we defined here. So then you can feed back to the client what the issue was. And the issue in this case is unable to authenticate with the provided credentials. Okay, so if the user was set, then we get to line 47, where we set the user attribute, which is the attributes that we're validating for the serializer. So then we can use this user in the view. This is what the view is going to expect to be set when the authentication was successful. So then finally, we return the attributes from our validate method. So that's how we handle the authentication in the serializer. Now we need to create a view that uses this serializer so that we can link that up to a URL so we can handle token authentication. Next, what we're going to do is open up the views.py inside our app/user project. And we're going to create a new view here for our auth token. Now, what we'll do is we'll actually import an existing view that Django REST framework provides for creating auth tokens. So we don't need to create a lot of the logic ourselves. We can use an existing view that's provided by the Django REST framework to do a lot of the work for us and just override a couple of things on that can make it a lot easier. So it makes it a lot easier. We don't need to write all of the code for creating a token. We can leverage the code that's already provided by the Django REST framework. So the view that they use by default is called obtain auth token. So underneath the import generics here, we're going to do from rest_framework.auth token.views import obtain auth token. And then we're also going to do from rest_framework.settings import API_settings. Now we're going to modify this line here with the serializers, and we're going to add a new serializer below, which is the one we just created, auth token serializer. Great. Next thing we're going to do underneath this existing view is we're going to type class create token view, and we're just going to base it off our obtain auth token that we imported from the REST framework. Now we'll add a doc string create a new auth token for user. And we are going to define our custom serializer class. Serializer underscore class equals auth token serializer. And then renderer class or renderer underscore classes equals API settings dot default underscore renderer underscore classes. Okay, so what we're doing here is we're using the obtain auth token view that's provided by Django REST Framework, and we're customizing the serializer to use the custom serializer we created. And the reason we do this is because the obtain auth token view uses the username and password instead of email and password. We want to customize this to be email and password in our serializers. So we override the behavior and we customize the serializer that's used with the default auth token view. And then this renderer classes here, this is totally optional. What this does is it uses the default renderer classes for this obtain auth token view. So by default, if we weren't to include this, we wouldn't get the browsable API that's used for Django REST Framework. It wouldn't show the nice user interface for that. So in order to ensure that that is enabled on this new view, we're going to add it manually inside the view. So we're going to define renderer classes. And I don't know why that it doesn't support that or it doesn't enable that by default. I think it's just an issue with the framework, but I like to add it to make sure that it is consistent and that all the different APIs that we create are available in the browsable API, because that's really handy for developers using our API. Okay, so now we can save the views. And the next thing we're going to do is define the URL. So if we open up the URLs and make sure you've opened up app/user/URLs, so the URLs that is for the user app, we're going to add a new path here, new path token / views.create token view.as_view, comma, name equals token. And because we've already connected up this urls.py module to the root app URLs, we don't need to do that again. So we can just add all of the URLs we need to add for our users project here in the users urls.py file. Okay, so that's all we need to do to enable the token API. Now let's go ahead and run the tests and see if we implemented everything successfully, or if there are some bugs or typos that we need to fix before we continue. So I'm going to type docker compose run rm app sh-c python manage.py test. Going to run the unit tests. And you can see serializer is not defined, and this is on line 28 of our serializers.py file. So what I did here was I missed the S on serializers in both cases here. So I must not be fully awake. We need to ensure that we're using the correct name here. So good job if you caught this already. If not, then I apologize. Please go back to the serializer.py file and add an S to serializers so that we can rerun the tests. And hopefully we'll see if this works. Okay, so the test passed successfully. We've now successfully implemented our token API, and we can move on to the next lesson.